So I apologize also for not having had a chance to read it, but I'll do it when I'm at home.
Should we give you our things now?
Yeah, that would be great. That's great. That's great.
One of each.
I don't know why, but I'm going to Israel tonight, and there's a notice on my computer that says, "Stay at the King David Hotel tomorrow."
Someone's tracking you.
You're not prepared.
Someone's tracking you. Okay.
Are they treating you too?
It didn't say that. So thank you for your comments. Lots of people raise interesting things. I thought a bit of time before we turn to shot. I want to spend a little bit of time responding to some questions that Shuki raised, because they were pretty basic questions about this enterprise. So, with your permission, Shuki, I'm going to read a little bit of your questions. You have it in front of you. Shuki in front of you there. Yeah. So, third paragraph. I am wary of the project of theology. In my mind, the process of translating transcendent experience into analytical terms, I circled analytical and said, God forbid, but that's okay, into analytical terms, whether to sustain one's own awareness or transform that of others, may well be a project of which we should say, Ein Dorshin. My first concern is that through the process of translation, the encounter may itself become corrupted or otherwise diminished. Transcendent experiences are not intellectual affairs. To express them in the language of the cerebral mind is of necessity a misrepresentation, no matter how generous the intent. It is so easy for the transmission to result in a dogma, a platitude, or simply a bizarre-sounding personal account. I fear that even the best expressions are poor portrayals of the consciousness lying behind them. Given this concern, I question whether theology is an effective means of strengthening or revisiting the initial experience. Additionally, I question whether theology has the capacity to bring others to, quote, see what the theologian has seen. If transcendent awareness emerges from a convergence of personal circumstances in what we might call grace, can an analytic presentation lead the uninitiated or unsummoned to the top of the mountain? Can it reverse the direction of translation from the worldly to the ethereal? So pretty basic challenges to the enterprise. And I thought...
You've been brooding since early morning.
Yeah.
But
I'll
be happy. I'll be happy.
Yeah.
Can I throw something in?
Please.
So last night I found myself God or about the origin of the world. So he was sort of saying, yeah, in my cultural context, everyone believes in faith, but that's not what I'm about. I don't think that's helpful. My project is separate. And that always sort of, it struck me, and it seemed a lot like a lot of things that are going on right now. A lot of trends that, well, I don't know about all that, but when something that helps me live a certain way. So, just to piggyback on CC's questioning the whole effort. I don't know how I feel about it, but...
Any more piggies? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, you were both reflecting yesterday on the why you did the Jewish version of it. And you both were talking about a language you were familiar with and a heritage and a tradition. It just struck me listening to you how different your background is from mine and from almost everyone I'm working with in Hillel now. The vast majority of the students have very little background. About half of them have a Christian parent of the Jewish students. So the rationale of why I do it, it was hard for me. The language you're speaking, for me, is until the last 4 years foreign. So I'm trying to then project. So instead of just reading your biography, I want to turn it into something that hard for me. It's hard for me. I love the reading, and there's many, many things that are beautiful, but to shoot, as you know, in the context of how do you make it into something that is used, it's challenging.
It's a different problem than he
Yeah.
Donna?
Yeah, I've been thinking about how it's interesting that we tend to do this communally as well. It really is an individual experience, so why is it that we, or other nations, religions, try to come up with something that works for everyone, at least having a basic framework? And what is that? What do we lose when we all try to conform to a way of seeing the world?
Well, we don't have a collective theology. Theologies are usually written by individuals, I would say. It's more halakha that we have collectively. It's more praxis that we have collectively. We have, I would say, a language and some rubrics for expressing things, but what you mean by those rubrics, what you mean by Hashem Echad, what you mean by Matan Torah, is so wide open. There's so much vast space in it. So I think it's mostly individuals who articulate it.
To respond to it.
I'm thinking to respond, but you go ahead.
Okay. So let me maybe just begin to throw a number of issues. So my question back to you is, what do you do with religious experience and religious consciousness? We all have experiences, and we respond, and the issue is not to what degree does the language that is responding to the experience map that in some kind of ontological or factual way. But what we're trying to do is give direction to our life in a confessional reaction to profound experiences. Sometimes those experiences take place in the world of nature, and you're trying to find a language in its own terms, but also to try to reframe it in the language of an inherited tradition. Part of the issue for me is what is the nature of one's honesty in relationship to experience, and how can those moments be used to open awareness and to build a life of spiritual integrity and consciousness around that. So I don't think it's a question of the response to these experiences being some kind of independent portrayal of the transcendent mystery. But it's the relationship between the self engaged in experiences that come to the self, and the self wants to give witness to that and shape a life around that. Now that life then is also brought into relationship to an inherited tradition. So that's that tension that we've been talking about of the personal voice, the idiosyncratic experience, and the collective voice of experience, and the struggle to try to live within a communal tradition with one's own authentic, with honesty, as a way of shaping one's spiritual growth, and to kind of open up a much larger awareness of the world that we live in. I mean, it sounds that part of what you're doing is you're reducing the response to religious experience to some kind of scientific way of describing, so that if it doesn't conform to that, it's not true to the experience, and then you're giving something false to someone else. But there's a highly subjective personal quality in that language in its own right, and then it's also folded into a traditional language. And that tension is a living tension, the same way as in prayer. Your own response to communal language and shaping it and directing it insofar as one wants to live a path of religious growth, a growth of awareness that can affect many other areas of one's life. So my first response to that is that um, uh, the side of the confessional aspect of the response. And the formulation is to give one a direction and a path for one's life, and to bring that into a living experience insofar as you want to live within a community. And I think that part of the issue that you may be facing with your students is to help them appreciate the authenticity of whatever experience they're having. And if they're making the commitment to try to develop a Jewish language, to help them understand what that tension is, how the personal and the communal voice are working together, and how they're beginning to kind of ritualize their way into a shared language. And so it would seem to me that that's the role of a religious teacher, to help guide that translation. And that translation is also to serve a kind of life. It's not just the abstract notion of the experience, but what is the relationship between experiences and religious rituals, and moving that into terms that sanctify life, they put you on a path of kedusha and awareness. And I think that you have to take the person at the level in which they are already at, to help them understand that dynamic and let them find a personal voice. So I think that, for people with certain biographies or very thick biographies, there's a lot more to struggle with, to translate, to reformulate. And insofar as we're sharing that, we're sharing how we're trying to forge a path so that you can take it in your own terms. I mean, I don't think that anything that Art or I are doing are trying to make claims that that's the only way. Within certain people who share certain sensibilities, this is going to give some guidance. And there's going to be a whole range of the Jewish community for whom this doesn't work in the least, both at the most liberal end and the more traditional end. But there are going to be people's religious consciousness that this is going to help give them terms and language that they have more access to the tradition. If you don't have the will to live a Jewish life, then this whole enterprise will not make sense, right? It's going to be a tension between natural and living experience and the desire to kind of shape it in Jewish terms. And that has to be a decision one makes for all kinds of other biographical reasons, not simply because the Jewish language is the only or best way. I think Art answered that very powerfully yesterday. It's not the only or necessarily the best, or the best for whom, but we make commitments to try to do that in Jewish terms, and insofar as there's a broader language of experience, we don't want to cut ourselves off from that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the Torah Klulav. There's much broader range that's constantly impacting one to kind of and bring all of these back into a Jewish way. So I think the final thing I would just say in this regard is everybody's going to have to make a decision of how and in what way you want to live a thick Jewish life, mentally, spiritually, and halachically. And then you have to go through that process of integrating and shaping. So I think you've given an autobiographical response that perhaps maybe these responses are so personal, or they are so ineffable that they simply stand where they are. My response is, well, how do you build a life beyond these occasional moments? They're just moment gods. They're just happenings. So how do you turn that into a sustained act of focus, a sustained act of...
He could say by ritual, by doing, by living the Jewish life, but not by...
What's going on in your head when you're doing the ritual? What is informing the ritual? You have to have some, from my point of view, you have to have some tamei mitzvot. You have to have some spiritual principles that are guiding this. Otherwise, it's it's formalism at the cheapest level from my point of view. You just, what are you doing?
But suppose that which guides it is the memory of that experience, is the memory. He's doing a Laman Tizkaru. Forgive me for speaking for you. He's doing a Laman Tizkaru. The experience is there, and that's the core, and the mitzvot recall it, as we said yesterday, Laman Tizkaru. Why is that? There's nothing certainly just a routine about that. It is connected to the memory of the experience. But he doesn't want to articulate that memory of that experience in any intellectualized terms because they betray it. They would inevitably betray it.
So what does it mean to have an experience? What does it mean to have that experience? That is just at the level of feeling. So how do you direct that feeling into life terms, into life forms, into forms of value? That's all I'm asking. How do you... What moves are you making, or how is anybody, if you're picking up on that claim?
Let me jump in a little bit.
Yeah,
Let me go another round. You all noted our similarities, and you all noted our similarities in ideology and our differences in style and approach. So it was, clear. I guess I have had certain experiences. To use Buzzy's language from today, I've seen some things, I've seen some things and heard some things that were very important and transformative in my life. I have a need to share those, to remind myself of those, and to share them with other people. Why do I want my private experiences of what I call God to be shared with other people? Because I think they will help people live better, richer, fuller lives. So I want to share them with other people. I think the mountaintop I have been on occasionally is one that is worth evoking for other people, partly to share their experiences of the mountaintop, to remind them that they too have been there or can be there. I have chosen for this sharing of my experiences to use a megaphone called Judaism. I could use a bigger megaphone called Islam, which would reach a lot more people. But because I am a Jew, and because this is familiar to me and works for me, I have chosen this particular megaphone, which is to say I'm taking something of those experiences and translating those experiences into the language of the Jewish tradition. So instead of talking about Art Green on Cadillac Mountain in 1960 or whatever in Maine, I'm talking about Art Sinai. I had another Acadia reference in my other class yesterday.
First anniversary, Mona and I went there.
So whatever it is. So instead of it being purely personal, it becomes Jewish. But then I have to ask, well, what am I conveying to this person of Yisrael? This kid who walks into BU Hillel, he's going to think, I believe that Moses and 600,000 adult male Israelites stood in front of Mount Sinai, and he's had an ancient history class where he knows that this is all myth and this didn't happen, or there's no proof for it historically. He's read stuff. So is this guy just trying to give me this primitive story like I'm supposed to swallow it? I'm not going to touch that. Well, that's nonsense. So then I have to begin to explain, well, why I am in connecting my own journey of inner experience to the language of this tradition, how I am using the language of this tradition in a non-literal way. And that already has me deep in this enterprise that I call theology. You may give it another term, but I call it theology, which is to say some of it is self-explanation, and some of it is how do we approach, because as I start doing that, as I start connecting my own peak experiences, shall we say, to Sinai, or to the Sneh, or to Abraham Avinu, or to passages in Tehillim, I sort of notice how very rich the tradition is. I start looking at Parshanut, and I start looking at the different layers that we're going to be seeing through Dr. Mishkin's work. We're going to see all these different layers. So I see all those layers, and I said, gee, I'd like to share that with you. It's just such beautiful, interesting stuff. but I have to share that with you in a way that you understand that for me this is something spiritually powerful and aesthetically beautiful, not something historically true, where you have to say yes or no, I believe this happened or I don't believe this happened. I've seen so many Jews turned off by, well, if God came down on the mountain and said you got to do it, and you got to do it. If God didn't say you got to do it, you don't got to do it, and that's the end of the story. And that kind of literalist dismissal of Judaism, it's every secular Israeli knows it well, along with most religious Israelis in Israel, so that's become, either yes or no. Either you believe that this happened literally, or else it's all bullshit, and let's go to the beach. And I just have to reject both of those, and I have to show people why I do and how I do. So it's that enterprise of showing another path between a kind of fundamentalist literalism that just I don't think will speak to many kids at BU unless they get involved in some very sort of cultish kind of way of falling into it, which I hope they don't. But
There are groups on campus.
I understand people who are pushing that all the time, very actively. And
I just want to slightly open another door, which I'll pick up when we start talking about the Pshat, but this is precisely the nub or the reason why my theology is a hermeneutical theology. It's the beginning of the awareness of our transformation and interpretation that we become responsible for and we live with and can constantly reinterpret. And that hermeneutical self-consciousness, which requires a certain theological honesty, requires a moral taking of responsibility for the world that you're reinterpreting and the tradition that you're reinterpreting and the way that you're mediating self-experience into the tradition, is at the core. It's at the very core, for me, of what it means to be a responsible living person. That we're constantly engaged in awareness or not awareness at some hermeneutical level. And that is a fundamental stance for me, which is at the level of all world experience and traditional experience, and I'll try to map out that spectrum. But absent that, you have cut away the ground of the fact that you are already formulating something as a primary experience that you're holding at some level of consciousness. And I think that we're struggling to how can you do this in the most honest way that says and unsays at the same time. Right? I have a colleague at Chicago wrote a book called Saying and Unsaying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's that double, saying and unsaying simultaneously.
I just want to add one more thing, and that is, for me, this is a countercultural exercise, because I look at the people who have the absolute literalist reading, but I look much more at the people who say the whole thing's nonsense, so let's go to the beach. I don't like the values on that beach. I don't like what's going on in contemporary culture. I think the decline, the utter decline and degradation of contemporary Western culture that we see in Trumpianism did not come out of nowhere. I think that there is a kind of utter materialism and cheapening hedonism that emerges in completely secular Western culture that I am against, that I want to provide an alternative to. And I think that the tradition and the life prescribed by the tradition does provide an alternative vision of what it means to be a human being and how to live your life to the values of either Hollywood or Wall Street or much of Tel Aviv. And I want to present that. I want to make that a real alternative for people. I think Judaism has much to say about what human life really is, but how can I do that? I can't do it by saying, God said it, here it is, you got to do it, it's true. I don't believe that. And I don't want to attract people who are looking for that, because they're not the more interesting people to me. The more interesting people are the people who are out there questioning values and looking for something and not knowing what they believe and asking, what can I believe? And those are my brethren. Those are my people I want to talk to. And so I feel a call. I feel a call to write for them in a way that they will find accessible and attractive.
Could other people just very briefly, if you wish, to just open up so that I can and Art can understand them? What is theology beginning to mean for you as an enterprise? Is it beginning to open up something? Are you still standing with this a stance that it's not the way to go, or is this somehow beginning to open up a personal door?
So I think for me, when I'm listening to you and I hear Shuki's critique of it, I think I'm an educator, and my goal is always, how do I give over experience to young people. I teach mostly middle school kids who are at this point really coming out against certain things and really chafe at any type of literal interpretation. And I think that for me, it's such a turning point, because they can either go down this, it's all BS, I'm going to totally reject it, or we can give them a path to saying that this is the sacred mythology, that there's real questions here, that all of your questions are needed. And I have always struggled on how to, what language can I use? And I think theology provides the language, because I can't give over my experiences, right? Because they are mine. I don't have a language initially to explain why I'm Jewish, why I'm choosing the rabbinate, why I'm fully in on this project. And for me, I think theology is the way that we can open the questions and show them that there are other people who are living Jewish lives who are asking your same questions, and that they're on the same search. And so
you're using it as a process of growth and reflection to help you find your own language as well.
yeah, and help them find their language.
Exactly. How about other people? Yes, Misha?
It seems as though it's another piece in the puzzle of trying to articulate an experience. So yesterday we were talking about Bach was the performance yesterday.
Yes.
So you can have that those emotions kicked up for you through music, or those emotions kicked up for you by seeing a painting of Cadillac Mountain, or poetry. I think is a great example with Tihilim. And I think that theology is just another piece in the puzzle of trying our hardest to articulate something that really can't be articulated. And I think that you need all of those operating simultaneously to get slightly closer to expressing the unexpressible.
I say somewhere in the first chapter here, I accept fully that theology is an art, not a science.
Yeah.
In the sacred attunement, you see in the kind of the move towards theology, it goes through music and so on, and poetry. But I try to express that the turning point is to make a difference between a personally articulated idiosyncratic experience and something that can begin to move toward the community. Right? So it's not like theology or religious experience can't be at the personal level. But to be Jewish is to be within a community. I had, the first time I had this as a very powerful experience, I don't think I was told, it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, and I was at a conference, and I was in Japan at the time of Tisha B'Av. And I had this astonishing feeling that not only was Tisha B'Av not Tisha B'Av, but if I couldn't share any language with anyone, that I had lost the resource of a particular Jewish moment, and the universal human sense of walking down the streets in Nara and in Tokyo also was empty. I didn't even have a connection with the people. And I felt so isolated with no language. So I think there's also this issue of helping people to decide, are you going to move from just pure selfhood and self-experience to join the Jewish enterprise? For whatever reason, people do that. It's not just going to be the experience itself is going to do that. And then theology begins to become a struggle, becomes an articulation, becomes something to share. And prayer is the fundamental mode for that, your own inner voice while you're articulating a communal voice. So, at least for me, that was a turning point to realize that theology is not just a private reflection, but it makes a commitment that I want to be part of a historical project for all kinds of reasons. Did anybody else have any? Yes, Ilana?
What does theology mean to us?
Yeah.
So I think for me, when I was in high school or college, I really needed theology to help explain how the arc of history bends towards justice and feeling a sense of being called to make the world a better place. That was really important to me. It still is, but now I think it's more about how do I stay grounded in a world that feels increasingly unstable, and how do I believe in my own power and potential just as a person to do good things in the world and to be the person that I know I can be. So it's both, I think, a values-based theology, but also now it's becoming more just how do I be my full self and help other people.
So theology becomes a shaping of consciousness, a directing, part of the cultivation of values and regrounding them, supporting them, things like that.
Yeah, it's way more personal now as I'm getting older.
But as a potential rabbi, how are you going to move from the way more personal to being responsible for helping a community? So then you're going to have to make that you're going to make a bridge, right? That's part of the whole thing that you have to work through at this point.
I'm attracted to the fact that we're talking about theology, because I want to have more of a theology. Up until now, I've sort of made do with a variety of ad hoc theology. So, if I'm in an intellectual conversation with someone or myself, maybe some kind of panentheist, or it's really pressed, I say, well, I can't say anything definite about God, of course, but it's sort of like you said yesterday, a prism through which I view the world, or a language, a metaphor, things like that. But then in other moments, the most striking is if someone has died, and I'm saying,